9132 now, I'm going to turn on some slides here, and we're going to look at some slides that have to do with starting out with the oxygen rule. They always ask this on the test. They like to ask this. Remember yesterday, class, I told you yesterday, class, that 10,000 feet was the good operating practice for use of supplemental oxygen. And I want to tell you that the actual FAA rules for oxygen use start at 12,500. Here we have 12,500, 14, and 15,000. You need to remember these three numbers. All right, you need to remember these. Now, and I want you to remember that this is above rather than at or above. One way you can remember that is that they originally proposed that these oxygen rules would apply at and above these altitudes. However, various aviation lobby groups said, oh, please, give us this one last westbound altitude of 12,500 feet. And they said, all right, we'll give you an inch, just 1 inch. In other words, every rule will apply above, these rules for oxygen will apply above these altitudes. In other words, you can fly all day long at 12,500 feet, and do you have to have any supplemental oxygen for anybody? No. But if you go above 12,500 and not above 14,000, then the crew needs to use oxygen after 30 minutes. The idea is just for clearing mountains. If you're going to be there more than 30 minutes, then the crew must use oxygen. If you're going to go above 14,000 even for 1 minute, then the crew must continuously use oxygen. If you go above 15,000, then the passengers must be provided with oxygen. So tell me this, class. What's the highest altitude you could fly for 5 hours, or 6 hours, or 10 hours, or all day for that matter, and not give any oxygen to your passengers? What? What? 15,000. You could fly at 15,000. See, passengers, they don't get oxygen until you get above 15,000. You could fly at 15,000. You don't have to give any oxygen to your passengers. Now, sometimes, though, if you're flying at 15,000, you're using oxygen continuously as required, your passenger will sometimes say to you, they'll say, Jack, what is that stuff you got on there? You say, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you. I have to use this continuously. It's oxygen, you put it on, And they'll say, well, don't I get any of that? You say, well, I don't have a whole lot to go around, and that's why I selected 15,000 anyway, so you don't get any, see? But, no, I'll tell you what, I've always shared oxygen. I've just kind of been like that. I was always taught to share. So I share my oxygen with people, all right? Just the way I am. That's the way I was brought up. But there's some people, they won't do it. I mean, they'll say, no, sir, the rules say you don't get oxygen until you're above 15,000. You don't get any, all right? Now, if you got a guy if you get up to say 15.5, now you'd have to give oxygen to your passengers. But some people have noticed a loophole here. There's some people have noticed a loophole if you want to save oxygen. While it says the crew must be provided with unused oxygen, above 15,000, it says that the passengers need to only be provided with oxygen. That means you could give them the oxygen bottle, show him how to put it on, but don't show him how to crack the valve. He'll never know. See, he'll think he's getting oxygen, I bet, see. So anyway, that's a way of saving oxygen if you really want to. But me, I tell you what, when I get above 10,000, I use oxygen and I give it to my passengers. Just the way I was raised, Go ahead and share my oxygen. Okay. Remember, this is above rather than at or above these altitudes. Okay, over on the next page, we have to do with right of way. All right, right of way. All right, first of all, paragraph A says, hey, it says whether you're IFR or VFR, it doesn't give you a right of way one way or the other. It says you're all equal, whether you're IFR or VFR. It says, though, right of way shall be determined by the following rules. It says, first of all, if someone's in distress, he has a right of way. Obviously, if you see a guy on fire, don't cut him out of the pattern, all right? He's got the right of way, all right? Okay, aircraft in distress has a right of way. Now it says converging. Take a look up here. If two aircraft are converging of the same category, the guy on the right has a right of way. Now, I said of the same category. Is a 747 in the same category as a Cessna 152? No. Yes, he is, because they're both airplanes. Category was airplane. We further divided category into class, single-engine land and multi-engine land. A 747 is in the same category as a Cessna 152. So tell me this. If you're here in a 152 Cessna, and over on the left is a Boeing 747 coming right at you, who has the right of way? No, he's supposed to say, oh, there's a 152, we better yield to him, all right? No, yeah. Okay, now, let me tell you though that I'll tell you what, I give the right of way to everybody, All right? Anybody I see out there, I figure they can't see me, I give them the right of way. I have never, ever tried to play chicken with anybody up there, all right? I give everybody the right of way. But technically, you would have the right of way and the 747 would not have the right of way. But like I said, I give the right of way to everybody, especially bigger people, okay? But there's a special rule here that says, just by the way, in converging cases, it says a balloon has a right of way over any other category of aircraft. Can you imagine? Who would want to steal the right of way from a balloon, all right? But anyway, basically the least maneuverable has a right of way. It says a glider has a right of way over an airship, an airplane, or a rotorcraft. Okay, now it says here that, and this is on the test, however, an aircraft towing or refueling other aircraft has a right of way over any other engine-driven aircraft. They ask a question on the test and it says this. It says that, for instance, you're on the right, and on the left you see an airplane towing a glider. Who has a right of way? The plane towing the glider. You would have to yield right of way to him because it says a towing operation has a right of way. Now, it says approaching head-on. When aircraft are approaching head-on or nearly so, each aircraft shall alter course to the right. Okay, now I'll tell you what. I taught ground school for years, trained thousands of students, and it took me about 3,000 students till I really learned what that said. Here's what I thought. I was mistaken. I had a sample problem I was working on for my class, and it said that you're flying along in a 152 Cessna, for example, and it said in the opposite direction you see a glider coming at you. And it said, who had the right of way? Who do you think has the right of way? I thought it was the glider. But it's not correct, because you see, the only time, because I thought this says here a glider has a right of way over an airship, an airplane, or rotorcraft. However, that's only under the paragraph of converging. And you see, approaching head-on is paragraph D, not under paragraph C. If you're approaching head-on, when aircraft are approaching each other head-on, each aircraft shall alter course to the right. So a glider doesn't have the right of way. If you're approaching head-on to a glider, and this is on the test, each aircraft shall alter course to the right. Any question on that? Okay. Overtaking. This just says the slower guy has the right of way, and when you pass, if you're the faster one, pass on the right. And in landing, this says that if two aircraft are landing, the one at the lower altitude has the right of way, right? But you're not supposed to dive in front of a guy and cut him off and say, you know, I got the right of way. Not allowed to do that, you know. Okay. All right. Over on the next page, it talks about parachutes, parachute, and acrobatic flight. We're going to just skip talking about that. If there's any questions on that, you can get that out of the special appendix. 9179, no, that talks about minimum safe altitudes. Now, this picture is not exactly correct here. And let me explain this to you to start with. First of all, as far as minimum altitudes, there are three areas you should know about. Congested areas, other than congested areas, and sparsely populated areas. Now, if you're over a congested area, you have to be 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle. Here's an obstacle here, such as maybe a big building. If you see a big building, you have to be 1,000 feet above it. But that's only true for 2,000-foot horizontal distance. Now, this picture's not quite correct because it sort of makes it look like you could fly down here. You can't fly down here, all right? You know, that's just as bad. You have to be 1,000 feet above it, but that's only true to a 2,000-foot horizontal radius. Okay, now if you're over other than a congested area, you have to be 500 feet above the surface. That would be over, say, farmland, for instance. And if you're over sparsely populated areas, such as open water, like the Lake Michigan or Lake Erie or the ocean or something, you have to be 500 feet from any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. Now, it doesn't have to be 500 feet above them. It could be 500 feet to the side, for instance. All right? So 500 feet from persons, vessels, vehicles, or structures. Okay, how low could you go out over the ocean? You could go right down to the water. How low could you go out over Lake Michigan? Right down to the water. But you have to be 500 feet from persons, vessels, vehicles, or structures. By the way, there's a special exception that says this doesn't apply when you're doing takeoffs and landings. There's also in other words, you can go lower during takeoffs and landings. There's also a special rule that says that you always have to be able to make a safe landing. In other words, if you were flying over Los Angeles, which goes forever, you were flying over Los Angeles and you were up at 40,000 feet, if you couldn't make a safe landing, you were too low. Okay, assuming your engine were to fail. If you couldn't make a safe landing with a power failure, you were too low. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, let's go over here to page 12, and I want to talk to you about the VFR hemispherical rule. All right, the VFR hemispherical rule here. This is a very important rule. Here's what this says. Take a look up here, class. This says they're going to make an attempt to prevent mid-air collisions. They're going to make an attempt to prevent mid-air collisions. And they want to say this. Everybody going west should fly at even thousands plus 500 on their altimeters. Everybody going east should fly at odd thousands plus 500. This is basically the rule. Now, take a look over here. The divider class, the divider is not the true north and the true south pole. The divider is the magnetic north and the magnetic south pole. Take a look at this slide. This slide shows the Rapid City VOR. Now notice that 0 here is cocked off to the right. That's because there's about 13 degrees of variation here. Here's an airway that runs down here, and this airway says on it 176 degrees. Now if you were going south on that airway, since that says 176 degrees, you're actually on the east side of the dividing line. A pilot going south on this airway then should fly at altitudes such as 5,500, 7,500, or 9,500 feet. If you were sitting in the back of the room though, and if you couldn't see this saying 176 degrees, you would probably think that that's a guy going basically in a westbound direction. You might think he'd fly at even thousand, but that's not correct. Because the divider class, look at here, the divider is the magnetic north and the magnetic south pole. Not the true north and true south pole, it's the magnetic north and magnetic south pole. Also class, I want to tell you that no matter how much wind you have, that doesn't change anything. It's not the heading that determines the altitude appropriate to your direction, it's your course. The regulation said that the altitude appropriate depends on your magnetic course, not your magnetic heading. So, if you were flying down this airway, which says on it 176 degrees, and you had a whole lot of wind from the west, causing you to hold a heading on your compass of 190 degrees. You're flying along and you're holding a heading of 190 degrees on your compass. Would that change anything? Would you still fly at odd thousands plus 500 with 190 on your compass? You sure would, because your course is still 176 degrees. Now, of course, a pilot going the opposite direction, his course is 356. So he would, of course, fly at even thousands plus 500. Now, by the way, there's a special rule that says this rule doesn't really take effect unless you are at least 3,000 feet above the surface. All right? Now, the elevation here of Rapid City says 3182. So that means that you could actually go up to 6182, or anything 6,000 or less, for instance. You could fly any altitude you want. So tell me this. Could a pilot go west here at, for instance, 5,500 feet on his altimeter? Could he do that legally here? Yes. Yes, he could, because the rule doesn't really take effect until you're 3,000 feet above the surface. The surface is 3,100 feet, so that means when you get above 6,000, above 6182, then you got to comply with the law. That's why on your training flights with your instructor, he likes to keep the plane below 3,000 feet above the surface. That way he can go in any direction he wants. But legally, once he gets up above 3,000 feet above the surface, he's supposed to comply with the east-west rule. Okay, and with these days of these altitude encoding transponders, it's, you know, you're telling on yourself all the time, you see. So, and this is a rule, this is a regulation. You can get an FAA violation if you don't follow these rules. Okay, so this is called the hemispherical rule. 9191 here talks about altimeter settings. And what this says is, it says, number one, you should keep your altimeter set to a station along your route of flight and within 100 nautical miles. That's what it says. This is on page 12, 9181, altimeter settings. It says, 9181, keep your altimeter settings. See this thing here? You are required by law to keep this set to a station along your route of flight and within 100 nautical miles of you at all times when you're flying cross countries, if you're maintaining altitude by reference to your altimeter. Okay? That's why whenever you call any flight service and you ask them for the weather, they always give you what you ask for, and then they always throw in, and the Cape Girardeau area altimeter is 3030. Okay, on the bottom of page 12, this has the portable air traffic control light gun signals. Every test I've ever taken asks you about these. So it's always a good idea to study these. What are these anyway? Well, take a look up here. This is a air traffic control light gun signal gun. Believe it or not, on the brightest of days, if you look down to tower, you can actually see these lights. Green light, red light, whatever they're giving you. They have a little sight on it, you see, so you can always see it. Now, these are used in the case of your aircraft radio failure. For instance, if you were coming into an airport with a control tower, and if your radio fails, you're allowed to come right over that airport. For instance, if this is Rapid City, you can come right over that airport. I'd come in over the airport traffic area, I'd look at the wind indicator and determine what runway's in use. Then I would go ahead and I would descend on a downwind leg, base and final, and maintain constant visual contact with the control tower. If the tower gives you a green light, that means you're cleared to land. If you don't get any light whatsoever, just put on a power and go around. Now don't buzz the tower, right? You're not supposed to do that, right? Just put on that power and go around. They'll know then. They'll see you then. They'll probably see you whenever you're on base leg or final. They'll probably see you. They'll see you flying over the airport trying to determine what runway to use. They'll give you a green light if they're not very busy. See, there's no problem. They'll give you a green light, meaning you're cleared to land. Now, what I've just told you is true for most airports with a tower. However, if you're flying over an airport with an ARSA, for instance, you're not allowed to do this. If an airport has an ARSA or a TCA and your radio fails, go to another airport. All right, don't land at an airport with an ARSA by light guns. You're required to go to another airport because you're required to have a radio at that airport, and even if it fails, you must then go to another airport at an ARSA airport or a TCA. Now, another thing is, if you go to an airport that just a regular airport traffic area, but overlying it is a TCA, don't fly up into TCA, waiting then descend into here. Or if you're going to an airport that you know is very busy, you know you're going to an airport, you know it's very busy there, and your radio isn't working, please land at another airport. Land at an airport without a tower. And if you really got to get over to Pewaukee Airport or to Rockford or someplace like that, and you know it's busy, call them up on the telephone. Tell them, my radio has failed and I'd like to come in because that's where my radio shop is. They'll say, sure, that's all right. What time are you going to be here? You say, I'll be there at 10:15. They'll say, okay, we'll watch for you and we'll give you a green light on downwind. Okay, so I want you to study these light gun signals. All the ones you may be asked are in your special appendix book there. But anyway, there's all of them you might get asked. A steady green in the air means you're cleared to land. After you land, you sometimes, if you were landing, they ask this on a test a lot. If you get a flashing red, that means get off the runway. This they ask you a lot on a test, and that says, what does it mean if you get an alternating red and green? That's a general caution. Use extreme caution. They ask that because nobody ever knows what that is. Right? One time the AOPA proposed that they simplify all this and just give it a green light means land, a red light means don't land. Because they said nobody can ever memorize all these. And the FAA thought about it for a while and said no. So anyway, so we still have to know all these.
At least they thought about it.
Yeah, at least they thought about it and said no. Okay, let's go over here to, right on page 15. This has the requirements to fly in a TCA, a terminal control area. All right, now I should update this. Here's the St. Louis terminal control area. This is a Group 2 TCA. Let me update this. Notice that it has the requirements to fly in a Group 1 and a Group 2 TCA. Both require a communication radio, and they may ask you this on the test. Both require a VOR radio, and they may ask you that on the test. Both require a transponder. However, notice that the Group 1 required a transponder with Mode C capability, and a Group 2 required a transponder but not required to have Mode C. Well, that's been changed now. I want you to know that a Group 2 is also required to have Mode C, so why don't you make that correction in your book there. The Group 2 TCA requires you to have a transponder with Mode C. Okay, must have a transponder with Mode C. Okay, and of course it's correct here to say that the Group 1 requires you to be a private pilot or a private pilot license, but only if you're landing at the primary airport. The only difference right now then between a Group 1 and a Group 2 TCA is that in a Group 1 TCA you must be a private pilot to land at the primary airport. Tell me this, O'Hare, Los Angeles, New York, these are Group 1 TCAs. Can a student pilot get a clearance through the TCA if he's not landing there?
Yes.
Yes, he can, but he can't get a clearance to land there as a student pilot. Oh, okay.
What about Group 2? I don't understand. What do you get?
At Group 2, you can be just a student pilot.
Oh, okay.
A student pilot can land there. Yes, sir.
They had one question that's confused me for a long time, and that's, I believe this is the one. Which equipment is required when operating an aircraft within a Group 2 terminal control area? And the answer is a 4096 code transponder. And yet down here it has all these other things listed, and that's what's confusing.
Well, a 4096 code transponder is any transponder, right? You do have to have a 4096 code transponder. That's correct. That's not incorrect. That is correct. You must have that. In addition, you have to have a transponder with Mode C connection. In addition, you have to have a VOR radio. In addition, you have to have a communication radio. It doesn't say all those things, but it is correct to say you have to have a 4096 code transponder, so that would be a correct response. Okay? All right, that's just half the answer, but that's part of it. Okay, on page 16, 9163 and 91165 talk about the requirements for maintenance. These are the maintenance requirements. The maintenance requirements are these. they talk about someone called the owner-operator. Now, take a look up here a minute, class. I'd like to tell you something. There are two people you are to know the responsibility of on this test. Only two people. The pilot in command or the owner-operator. The pilot in command, well, let's take a look at our fact sheet here. We can see exactly what he's responsible for. Let's get out our yellow fact sheet for a minute. Let's get out our yellow fact sheet. It tells you the responsibility of the pilot in command and the owner-operator. It says the pilot in command is responsible for the operation of the aircraft and anything that may happen while he's in command, and number two, for determining whether the airplane is airworthy prior to flight. Now, the owner-operator, he's responsible for three things, but let me tell you something. Take a look up here, class. If someone would ask me the responsibility of the owner-operator in one word, could I answer that in one word? I'd say yes. And that word is maintenance. The owner-operator is responsible for maintenance. In other words, the owner of the airplane is responsible for the maintenance of the airplane, not the mechanic. The owner-operator. The operator may be you if you're the pilot, even though someone owns the plane. So the pilot sort of is responsible for these things too. Anyway, the owner-operator is responsible specifically for maintaining the aircraft in an airworthy condition, seeing to it that the airplane is repaired and inspected as the regulations require, and seeing to it that the maintenance personnel make appropriate entries in the aircraft and engine maintenance logbooks indicating that the aircraft has been inspected and released for return to service. All right? So he's responsible for maintenance. Okay. That's what it tells us there in 91-163 and 91-165. It says the owner-operator is responsible for maintenance. Now I want to tell you this. On this FAA test, any answer about responsibility, such as mechanic, air traffic controller, line boy, or fixed base operator, is wrong. All right? There's only two correct answers on this test for responsibility. One of those is the pilot. You can see what he's responsible for, and the owner-operator. He's responsible for maintenance. Okay? Alrighty. 91-167 has to do with flight tests. Or test flights, actually. Test flights. I just want to tell you that if an airplane has had a repair or alteration which may appreciably change the flight characteristics, such as you've just had a wing changed or an aileron changed, the airplane would have to have a maintenance flight test. Test flight. But that's only required if you're going to carry passengers. I want you to circle that word there in the little notes there. It says, and you plan to carry passengers. Now they try to fool you on the test by saying, you've just had a plane that's had a wing change, for instance. It says, which of the following situations would require a maintenance test flight? And answer A says, you will be using the plane for a commercial operation. Does that require a maintenance test flight? No. No. I didn't say anything about commercial operations. Can't we haul freight without carrying passengers? Can't we tow banners without carrying passengers? So you see, you could do that. You just can't carry passengers until you've done a test flight. All right? Before you carry passengers, you have to have that done. It can be done by any private pilot. Doesn't have to be a test pilot or anything, and he logs it in a book and signs it himself. Okay, and on the next page here it talks about inspections, and what it tells us here is that just as I mentioned earlier, I said that every airplane, if you want to maintain the airworthiness certificate, you have to have an inspection within the previous 12 calendar months, all right, to maintain the airworthiness certificate. Also, you have to have any other maintenance items complied with. Occasionally there are things like airworthiness directives and so on. And those, let me tell you what an airworthiness directive is, class. Occasionally the administrator will come out with an airworthiness directive. It's sent to the owner of the airplane, and it tells him, and to the maintenance people, it tells him that certain Cessnas are having, or Pipers or Beechcraft are having certain failures of an oil pump at 200 hours or whatever. And an airworthiness directive says that that must be complied with. That oil pump has to be inspected and replaced as necessary. And then the mechanic will enter in the logbook that the plane has been inspected and that the airworthiness directive has been complied with. If you don't get this done, if you don't have this completed, as the administrator says, then we say that the airworthiness certificate is invalid. So the airworthiness certificate is valid as long as the airplane is maintained and inspected according to the regulations. Class, I'd like to talk to you now about advisory circulars. In fact, I'm required specifically by regulation to tell you about advisory circulars. I'm not allowed to sign you off for your written tests unless I tell you about advisory circulars. Well, I want to tell you that the FAA issues advisory circulars. It tells us right here. The FAA issues advisory circulars to inform the aviation public in a systematic way of non-regulatory material of interest. They're going to ask you on the test, who issues these? That's easy. The FAA issues them. They're going to say, are these regulatory? The answer is no. These aren't a regulation unless they're incorporated into a regulation by reference. The contents of an advisory circular are not binding on the aviation, not binding on the public. Now they ask you, how are these numbered? They're numbered in a system having to do with the regulations, such as a 00 series is of a general nature. A 60 series has to do with rules like Part 61, sort of certification rules. A 90 series, this has to do with rules having to do with Part 91, for instance, like the rules of the air. So it says that the advisory circulars are issued in a number subject system corresponding to the subject areas in the FARs. The advisory circular numbers relate to the subchapter titles and correspond to the parts and, when appropriate, the specific sections of the FARs. Now let me tell you this, class, they ask you on the test, are these free? They're not free. Some are free, but some you pay for. You go down to the government bookstore, they have a book called the Private Pilot Flight Manual and an aviation weather book. Those are all advisory circulars, 300 pages long or so. But those are not free. You pay 10 or 12 bucks for them, whatever. All right, last thing I want to talk to you about is NTSB Part 830. All right, NTSB Part 830. All right, I want you to know that they ask you sometimes on a test. This is the only question on the test where they ask you a regulation number. And the question is, what part of the regulations have to do with accidents, incidents, or overdue aircraft? And the answer is NTSB Part 830. Okay? Now, before we talk about accidents, let's learn what is an accident. You can look right up here, Regulation 830.2, definitions. It has a big, long, legal mumbo-jumbo, but I think the easiest part to understand is simply the last part, where it says, or in which the aircraft receives substantial damage. So certainly, substantial damage is a definition of an accident. All right? So let's use that for now. Substantial damage is a definition of an accident. Now, it tells us over here, initial notification. Tell me this, class. When do you think the FAA or the NTSB wants to hear about an accident? Immediately. That's the answer. How soon do you notify? Immediately. The operator of an aircraft shall immediately, and by the most expeditious means available, notify the NTSB Bureau of Aviation Safety Field Office when an aircraft accident, or in fact any of the following incidents occur. So if you're in an accident, the first thing you're supposed to do, say, get me to the NTSB. Get me to a phone. I got to call the NTSB. You're supposed to call them right away. Now, it says, or any of the following incidents occur. Now, what's an incident? Well, an incident is one of these 5 approved incidents. These are the only 5 approved incidents. Now, anything that would be substantial damage is, of course, an accident. So take a look up here. Now, the idea here is if any of these things happen and there's no substantial damage, then you have to report it. All right? For instance, here's an NTSB approved incident. Flight control system malfunction or failure. If somehow your ailerons and elevators jam in flight, and somehow you miraculously land the airplane by the use of trim tab and doors, all right? They want to hear about that, okay? And there's no substantial damage, they want to hear about that. Or, inability of a crew member to do his duties. Somehow you're unable to do your duties and your passenger has to take over and land the airplane. They want to hear about that also, assuming there's no substantial damage. A turbine engine fails. They don't care about piston engines, just turbine engines. An in-flight fire. If there's an in-flight fire and there's no substantial damage, they want to hear about that too. Or aircraft collide in flight and there's no substantial damage. They want to hear about that one, okay? Anyway, but of course, if there's substantial damage, then you have had an accident. So then you notify them under other rules. Or it says, or immediate notification if an aircraft is overdue and believed to have been involved in an accident. You're supposed to notify them immediately if you know about such a case. Okay, now then it talks about reporting of accidents and incidents, and it gives some time periods here. You may want to look at here. Look at yours. I got mine here. Okay, I got it. Reporting of it. It says reports. It says that reporting the operator of an aircraft shall file a report as provided in paragraph C of this section. Within 10 days after an accident or 7 days if an aircraft is overdue and believed to have been aircraft is still missing. So it's 10 days for accidents, 7 days for overdue aircraft. Okay, so you want to know that. Anyway, everything that's in the you want to look at your special appendix, and that'll cover everything having to do with these what you want to know for the test on this. Yes, sir.
With regard to the first and immediate notification,
Mm-hmm.
an in-flight fire.
Okay.
Would an in-flight fire be construed as smoke in the cockpit?
Oh, I don't know. The question is, would an in-flight fire be construed as smoke in the cockpit? Oh, go ahead and tell them for good measure, all right? I don't know. I'm not sure. I would say, you know, smoke is smoke. Well, I'd say where there's smoke, there ought to be fire. I've heard that. I wouldn't tell anybody if I didn't have to. Okay. Okay. All right. Now, if you were flying along and you were talking air traffic control and you said, help, help, I got an emergency, I got smoke in the cockpit, get me on the ground, quick. Well, now you better tell somebody about it, okay? Now you better file a report. Okay, I want to talk to you about an ELT, class. An ELT. An ELT. What is an ELT? Well, an ELT, class, is an emergency locator transmitter. Now, don't confuse that with a BLT, which is a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich. They don't ask about that on a test. Only an ELT, all right? Now, it's getting late, right? Okay, I want to tell you that some facts about an ELT. First thing I want you to know is, I want you to know that every airplane, except for the following exception, must have an ELT. And that exception is training flights that operate within 50 miles point of origin, they need not have an ELT. Okay? I want you to know about that for the test. Training flights that operate within 50 miles point of origin, they need not have an ELT. Now, actually, there are more exceptions, but don't write them down. Airliners don't have to have an ELT, and agricultural airplanes don't have to have an ELT. And by the way, before I go on, I guess I ought to tell you a little more about what an ELT is, all right? It's an emergency locator transmitter that goes off on the impact force of a crash. And it sends off a warbling tone that sounds like this. Woo, 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 woo. And it goes off on frequency 121.5. It also activates on 243.0, which is the ultra-high frequency UHF military frequency. By the way, you notice that that's the double harmonica 121.5. Okay? Now, it sends off this warbling tone. You hear it out there. This guy's ELT out there. Anyway, now they're all over. I want to tell you that the FAA wants you to know a couple things about the ELT. First of all, they don't want everybody testing their ELTs. You can imagine why. How would it be if everybody in their run-up tested their ELT? And the F towers are monitoring 121.5. So they don't want you testing your ELT. But if you say, I got to test my ELT, they made a rule for you. It says, all right, you can test it, but only between on the hour and 5 after the hour. That's on the test, so you want to know that. Test your ELTs between on the hour and 5 after. Also, when you test your ELT, you're only supposed to test it through 3 audio sweeps. Woo, woo, woo. End of test. Okay? Another thing I want you to know about is the battery replacement. I want you to know that the batteries are required to be replaced after 1 hour of cumulative use, or after 50% of the shelf life of the battery. If the battery is supposed to be good for 6 years, the battery will have to be replaced after 3 years. And I understand this has to be marked on the outside of the ELT so that you can just look in where the ELT is and you can see when the batteries are supposed to be replaced. They don't ask that on the test, though, but they do ask about battery replacement. 1 hour of cumulative use or after 50% of the shelf life of the battery.
Class, I want to thank you for using my VFR Ground School tape series. I can say that it has been a pleasure for me and all the professionals I've worked with at Video Training Aids in making this presentation available to you. I would like to mention that VTA has also produced 14 other video training tapes. Instead of dealing with ground school, though, the other tapes deal with flight training and are the best available. I use these tapes with my own students and find them to be of tremendous value. The videotapes allow me to feel confident as an instructor that nothing has been omitted from a student's flight training program. Some of the tapes that I find of particular value include tape number 7. It deals with the private pilot flight maneuvers. Tape number 11 I also like, and it deals with stalls and spins and their recovery. I also recommend the complete multi-engine tape series, covering everything from basic multi-engine operation to multi-engine IFR operation. Class, keep in mind that out there in the real world, we must always make a 100%. A 70% just won't make it. Remember, ground school is always your best investment in safety.